Hi, I'm Joe Copalman, guest instructor with 3G Aviation Media, and tonight I'll be doing a real-time walkthrough on how to set up and execute a night shot of a large aircraft. The techniques I'll be covering are using your camera's live view function for framing and focus, and then using a technique known as light painting with an LED flashlight to illuminate the subject during the exposure. The basic equipment needed for this are going to be a digital camera, a compatible lens, a tripod or something steady to rest your camera on while you're shooting, and then a remote shutter release, preferably something that has a locking function, but that's not entirely necessary. For light painting, any bright LED flashlight is going to work, but I'd really recommend something with a focusable or zoomable beam that's rated at 1,000 lumens or higher. The flashlight I've been using for the past few years is rated at 1,300 lumens, and I've never found myself wishing that it was brighter. For this demonstration, I chose to shoot the Lockheed EC-121T on display at the Pima Air and Space Museum, and I did this for two reasons. First, it's a relatively large aircraft, and my intent here is to show that these techniques can be applied to even some of the largest subjects out there, that the size really doesn't matter here. Second, this aircraft's just an absolute mess. It's got 4 engines, 3 tails, and massive black-faced radomes on the belly and on the spine. And all those surfaces are going to demand your attention when you're lighting it up at night. I also deliberately chose to shoot it from a front quarter angle, partly because that's my favorite angle to shoot statics from, but mostly because, kind of for our purposes here, it's the most difficult angle for night photography when it comes to lighting a subject up. When shooting something either side on or nose on, or even tail on if you're into that kind of thing, most of the surfaces you're lighting up are perpendicular to your camera sensor, so the light tends to hit it somewhat evenly. From a quarter on angle, the goal, or more accurately, the challenge, is to get as much light reflecting back onto your sensor from the more distant surfaces toward the tail as you're getting from the front of the aircraft. For this shot, I'll be standing immediately behind my camera while I light up the subject. This really helps keep unwanted shadows to a minimum, as the light I'm projecting onto the aircraft and the light that's reflected back to my camera sensor will be pretty much in alignment with one another. You can certainly light it up from any angle that you choose. In fact, my preferred angle is a front quarter shot like this, but with hard side-on lighting that creates some dramatic shadows. It's really kind of my favorite way to do it. My overall aim here is really just to give any photographers who are new to night photography or light painting confidence in what they can do with their own gear, even when faced with challenging subjects shot from challenging angles. Before we dive into the walkthrough, just a brief overview of my setup. I've got my camera secured to my tripod with my lens's image stabilization turned off and the focus mode set to manual. With all that set, we're pretty much ready to get the focus and the framing dialed in and to light this sucker up. All right, so starting out, we're going to look at camera settings really quick. There's really no wrong answer for shooting at night. I like to shoot with a low ISO. 100 is the lowest I can go on my camera. Just limits noise when you're processing it with longer exposures. Aperture, a lot of people like to go wider when they're shooting at night to allow more light in. I like to use apertures like f8, f11 that allow you to have more sharpness nose to tail on an aircraft, especially in a big aircraft like what we're shooting here. But that, again, you can play with that a little. And then bulb mode just allows us to control the aperture as we see fit there. So the way that you want to focus on an aircraft here, you're going to go to live view if your camera has it. And then what we're going to do is we're going to use the zoom feature, which is right here. And and so you're going to zoom in on a part on the subject and see if we can see anything. So I have my camera zoomed all the way out, and you can see we've got some of the aircraft there. So I will zoom in right there, and it looks like we are just on the nose of the aircraft there. So what I'm going to do is putting a very powerful flashlight on the nose of the aircraft, start adjusting my focus to get some detail. And there we go, starting to come into frame, and we'll zoom again just to get as close as we can. Keep that. Oops, there, and it looks like we're good right there. So now what we're going to do is zoom out, and we want to make sure that we've got it framed. I'm zoomed all the way out here on my camera, and I want to come just outside of the outboard propeller tips there. And going through, framing across, make sure I've got the outboard propeller tips there as well. So that's basically how we set it up. It's just getting everything focused in using live view and zoom, and now we are ready to shoot. Okay, so now that we've got focus and framing taken care of, we're going to go ahead and light the subject up and shoot it. So I'm going to go ahead and lock my shutter open using my cable remote, and I'm going to start lighting from the left side of the frame to the right. And so I'm going to go ahead right now. Shutter's open, and I'm going to start just lingering on this engine on the right side, making sure to get the tips of the props and making sure to get those tail surfaces in the back. Those are almost parallel to us, so they're not going to reflect as much light as surfaces that are perpendicular to us. So I want to make sure you're getting attention on that. And a good way to reach those is I use an LED flashlight with a zoomable beam. And that's really good for kind of reaching out and illuminating stuff that's much further away from you here. Now, one thing that people tend to do when they do light painting at night is they do a lot of sort of squiggly lighting like that, and that really doesn't give you much time sort of burning the light onto your sensor here. So if you just kind of linger on what you want to light up, and it's just important to remember that surfaces that are perpendicular to you are going to reflect a lot more light than surfaces that are parallel. Obviously things that are painted black, like this radome down here and on top, those are not going to reflect as much light too. And then places like this, sort of middle of the fuselage, not perpendicular, not parallel, but you want to make sure you're lighting that up as well. You get closer to the nose, it's going to reflect a lot more light because it's closer to you and it's almost perpendicular to you. So that's another thing. You want to make sure you're lighting it up good, but you want to make sure that you're not overdoing it, because you can really blow that out, especially compared to the stuff in the back. It's just much harder to light the stuff toward the back. But this is just using a single flashlight. Make sure I get the landing gear down there. And again, mid-fuselage, the radome up top. Make sure I get out here. The engines again. And just making sure I'm going to have enough light on the subject to make it pop up against the background here. Again, let's do the front. Make sure we're getting some good light there. And alright, I think we're ready to close the shutter here. So I'm going to go ahead and close it. Alright, here's the completed image. A few things I could have done better. I could have lingered a little bit less on that engine on the far right of the frame. Early on I was kind of blabbering on as I was lighting that up, so that got a little bit more light than I wanted it to. And then I could have spent a little bit more time lighting up the top of the forward fuselage. Aside from those two gripes, I'm pretty satisfied with the result here, especially since I chose the subject and the angle specifically because they both presented a pretty significant challenge. While light painting is often talked about as kind of like an artistic or an arty approach to night photography, I found it to be a pretty practical solution to the problem of lighting stuff up at night while on actual assignments for publication. What I like about using a flashlight with a focusable beam is that I can use it pretty precisely to light up only my subject, whereas if I were using a flash gun or a strobe or whatever they call it in your country, it would light up most of the scene or more of the scene than I'd want lit up. Whereas the focusable beam, I can just focus that on my subject and keep the background dark, and I really like that, and the foreground. Practical applications of this technique are just something that I want you to think about as you work light painting into your toolkit as a photographer, and hopefully this was of use to you in some way. Thank you for your time and for listening, and again, this is Joe Copalman, guest instructor with 3G Aviation Media.